Good morning, good evening, everybody. We'll just wait for a couple of minutes for people to join and then we'll get started. Thank you for joining. Good morning, good evening, everybody. Welcome to this media briefing on the High Seas Treaty. What's next? We'll be discussing the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction PrepCom 3 meeting, which happened recently. Discuss what's coming up next with the High Seas Treaty, and we'll have a Q&A at the end of the session. Just to let you know that this session is being recorded and we'll make the recording available. If you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A function that you can see at the bottom, and feel free to add them as we go, and because we'll go through quite a few details in the meeting and it might be difficult to recall all of those details by the end. So feel free to add questions as we go and we'll try to answer them all at the end. My name's Rebecca Hubbard and I'm the Director of the High Seas Alliance. Sorry, I forgot to mention that at the beginning. So thanks again for joining. Just to get started, essentially, if you haven't come across the High Seas Alliance before, we're an alliance of 80 plus members, including the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, with a growing membership in all regions of the world. The alliance was established in 2011. And our mission is to conserve the high seas, which cover half our planet. It's essentially a partnership of organisation and groups aimed at building a strong common voice and constituency for the conservation of the high seas. And we work together to inspire, inform, and engage the public, decision makers, and experts to support and strengthen high seas governance and conservation. So kicking off in terms of where we're at, maybe since you're joining this briefing, you'll be familiar that the treaty was agreed in 2023 and was required for 60 governments to ratify it for it to enter into force. That magic 60 was reached on the 19th of September last year, pretty much exactly 2 years from the date that it was opened for ratification, and then it entered into force 120 days later on the 17th of January this year. The fact that it took just 2 years to achieve the 60 ratifications was really quite phenomenal and fast by international treaty standards, and really reflects the broad and deep political support for the treaty, particularly globally, because that those parties to the treaty now actually come from all regions of the world. We currently have 88 parties to the treaty, so 87 countries plus the EU, and 145 countries have signed, marking their commitment to the treaty. We've had this includes the latest 2 ratifications of Austria and the Dominican Republic that had just joined in March, Austria joining during the PrepCom 3 meeting. As a positive side note and an indicator of the momentum that we're really seeing with ratification, the PrepCom co-chair Adam McCarthy, who is also Australian, highlighted during the PrepCom meeting that Australia has also just approved ratification in Parliament and is undergoing final formalities before officially depositing in the coming months. Other countries like Germany have also recently approved ratification through their political processes and are just going through final steps. So there's still quite high momentum with ratifications, which is really significant and important, and really want to highlight the importance of moving from 60 to global, in that the treaty is about the shared responsibility for the global ocean, and protection requires collective action. And in order to be maximally effective, we need as many countries party to the treaty as possible from all regions of the world. For many developing countries, the treaty is about access, capacity, and fairness, and ensuring that they can participate fully and benefit from the opportunities that the treaty creates. So I guess the only really other things to mention around ratification and why this is still really very much a priority, despite the fact that the treaty has entered into force, is that time is really of the essence. And as we move to COP1, and we'll discuss as we go through this session, there's significant decisions that need to be made. The treaty has entered into force, so there are already requirements for action. And we want as many countries to be party by that first COP, so that they can be at that decision-making table and contributing to the setup and the functioning of the treaty beyond COP1. And really, we're doing everything we can to avoid delays and blockages, both to ratifications and the operationalisation of the treaty. So for today's session, we're going to run in a bit more detail for you on the PrepCom 3 meeting. So the Preparatory Commission, the 3rd session of the Preparatory Commission, took place over 2 intensive weeks at the end of March, and really brought together governments to finalise the rules and institutions that will guide and operationalise the treaty. Discussions were largely constructive, and there was a lot of very positive energy, particularly at the beginning, and especially in the first week, with quite a bit of technical progress made in some areas. However, as negotiations progressed, particularly in the second week, we saw divergence in some political issues, as opposed to not exactly technical, but more political divergence, with divisions emerging on a number of key issues. So we'll talk through those in this briefing. The co-chairs worked intensively. I think they really brought a lot of ambition and a strong can-do attitude, like hopeful, but also this will require hard work. And they really brought that attitude to the entire PrepCom meeting. And they produced a series of papers in advance and then during the meeting towards the end of the session to try and move the process forward. But several elements of the text did remain unresolved, with options or bracketed provisions remaining in even at the end of the PrepCom meeting, and some countries and groups withholding their positions on key items as they required further political decisions to really finalise those issues. So as a result, regrettably, a number of critical issues have effectively been deferred to later and at COP1. This really results in delay and uncertainty, which we'll go into a little bit more, and means the job is not finished. And really the focus now shifts to intersessional work and COP1 to resolve these issues. So that first COP, which we've always talked about the importance as a decision-making moment, well, this is now even more critical in finalising that institutional framework and enabling the treaty to start working fully. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Riza Sakredahukos, our Asia Regional Coordinator, to run you through some of the details of the technicalities. Over to you, Riza.
Thanks, Beck, and thank you for joining us tonight or this morning, wherever time zone you are in. So, as Beck mentioned, the PrepCom lays the foundation on how the treaty will be implemented in the next coming years, and having a strong, transparent, and inclusive institution under BBNJ will be crucial to ensure that the treaty will deliver its ambition effectively. So the third session is the last meeting of the BBNJ PrepCom before COP1, and so key decisions were expected to be made during the last 2 weeks in the UN headquarters. And on the rules of procedure, basically the Conference of the Parties Rules of Procedure is like the Bible of all state parties to translate the BBNJ provisions into practice. So it sets the standards and guidance how decisions will be made in the future. There are still a few issues that need to be resolved, but there are also important ones that were tentatively agreed, and that includes, for example, the annual meeting of the Conference of the Parties, which will be held in the first few years, and will eventually transition to every 2 years COP meeting. So there was a general support that the transition should be decided by the COP and not have a definite time for now. And there was also flexibility to hold virtual meetings on exceptional circumstances without having any substantive decision making made in those virtual meetings. And then there was also good progress on having closed meetings to be time bound, and it needs to be agreed by majority. And that falls on the next issue that we would like to share with you on transparency and observer participation, which essentially focuses on it cuts across different agenda of the PrepCom, including rules of procedure and how modalities of the subsidiary bodies or the committee under BBNJ will operate. So delegations discussed a two-step approach to observer participation, where a single state can object to a new observer participation application, but the final decision is still deferred to the Conference of the Parties or the COP. So in practice, this creates uncertainty because an observer could be objected to and left in limbo until the COP takes a decision, and likely the decision will be made at the start of the meeting, and it raises some practical questions and barriers to participation. So we see this as not neutral, and for example, well-resourced organizations may be able to take the risk of attending despite an objection, but others, particularly those requiring visas or with limited resources, may be effectively excluded in the process. Observers who participated in the BBNJ intergovernmental conferences and PrepCom are also will be granted automatic observer status so that the non-objection procedure applies only to new observers, meaning access to the process may become uneven over time. Our concern is without clear and consistent rules, this approach could definitely lead to restrictive or inconsistent participation in practice and ultimately limiting transparency and inclusivity in BBNJ processes. So, transparency and inclusive participation are absolutely central to whether BBNJ succeeds, and observers, including scientists, indigenous peoples and local communities, civil society, they bring essential and diverse expertise and accountability and legitimacy to the process. So ultimately, you cannot deliver effective ocean protection without inclusive participation. And I mentioned earlier that the observer participation issue also cuts across with the subsidiary bodies, and while observer participation is also one of those sub issues under this agenda. The subsidiary bodies are committees under BBNJ that will provide recommendations to the Conference of the Parties on different aspects of its implementation, including, for example, whether to conduct environmental impact assessment, how to make sure capacity building and capacity needs are met, benefit sharing, equitable benefit sharing, and the establishment of high seas marine protected areas. So there was a convergence or general support that these committees will have limited membership to facilitate faster work delivery. But these committees can also create ad hoc working groups and subcommittees, including an ad hoc expert members. So there was also a strong support to enable the committees to work intersessionally, which means even after the meeting of the Conference of the Parties, members of the subsidiary bodies can meet and continue their work, whether in hybrid format or virtual. So the meetings are also ensured that it will be open to observers by default. And if there will be a closed session, only if there will be a closed session, it will be time bound and it needs to be agreed by 2/3 of the majority. But we would like to note that there's no agreed interim measures yet to allow the nomination of members of the subsidiary bodies, especially for the scientific and technical body, unless there will be special modalities that will be adopted at COP1. Uh, there is a risk that the subsidiary bodies will not be elected until the second meeting of the COP. And then this will definitely impact the timeliness of implementation of BBNJ because these committees and bodies are central to providing guidance and recommendations on future COP decisions. And on the secretariat arrangements, the priority is that the Secretariat of BBNJ should be independent, transparent, effective, inclusive. Definitely, it needs to be well-resourced and able to support all parties and stakeholders effectively. There were some discussions that have advanced already, including an agreement on how the process to select the seat of the Secretariat will be done. But on Secretariat, potential institutional arrangements with the UN, it remains to be decided at COP1. So there were a couple of models or options presented, whether the Secretariat, up to what extent could be the potential relationship of the BBNJ Secretariat with the UN. And there is also an urgency to decide on this because there are other issues on other items that are directly interrelated with the secretariat arrangement and the risk delays as other areas are dependent on each other, including the financial architecture of the BBNJ. Another key issue that was discussed in PrepCom 3 is the finance. Some important points that were agreed on included, for example, the scale of assessment that will be used to determine the financial obligation or the contribution of each state party to the annual budget of the BBNJ. And then there are three financial mechanisms under the agreement. And there was also a general support that the voluntary trust fund will primarily support the participation of developing state parties to the BBNJ. While there was an agreement also to establish an ad hoc committee between COP1 and COP2 to set up the special fund. Delegations also agreed on the content of a draft memorandum of understanding between the Conference of the Parties and the GF Council, since GF Trust Fund is also one of those identified financial mechanisms under BBNJ agreement. So both Special Fund and GF Trust Fund will support the implementation of the BBNJ agreement, particularly the developing state parties to BBNJ. And there were still some outstanding issues, including financial rules, matters related to finance committee, and how these different funding streams that I mentioned earlier, how this will function in practice to support the participation of developing state parties and the implementation of BBNJ without having duplication of mandates. So these decisions are closely linked also to the secretariat arrangements, meaning if there will be delay on either one of those issues, it could definitely affect the entire system or the entire foundation of BBNJ. So this matters because without clear, predictable financing and accessible financing, particularly for developing countries, participation, equity, and implementation of the treaty could be significantly constrained from the outset. And another important agenda that was agreed or decided or discussed during the last session of the PrepCom is the clearinghouse mechanism. So this is central to the implementation of the agreement because it houses the information of all the key pillars of the agreement when it is implemented. There is a general support to have a prototype by the first conference of the parties, by the first meeting of COP, and there will be a call for proposal to select the technical partner who will build the prototype. So we just wanted to be clear that the prototype is a different, let's say, platform. It's just a prototype and not the actual clearinghouse mechanism yet, which will be decided upon by the COP. So it's important to note as well that having a prototype by COP1 is very important for several reasons, including it supports a more concrete interim arrangement between PrepCom 3 and COP1. And the architecture of the prototype can inform COP of future decisions in building the actual clearinghouse mechanism platform. And definitely for developing state parties, clearinghouse mechanism is key to access immediate non-monetary benefits, which includes, for example, data sharing. And on indigenous peoples, discussion on indigenous peoples' rights and participation delivered some important structural progress and end with clearer recognition of indigenous peoples as a distinct group within observer participation and stronger alignment with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So there are also meaningful entry points emerging through subsidiary bodies, including a dedicated space for traditional knowledge and pathways for Indigenous experts to contribute to the work of the agreement. However, there was a proposal for a formal Indigenous advisory mechanism, which provides a more systematic and rights-based approach to this participation, but the discussion on this and negotiation has been deferred to COP1. So the priority now is to build on these foundations to ensure that participation is not only recognized in principle and on paper, but fully operationalized in practice, with Indigenous peoples meaningfully engaged as rights holders across all aspects of implementation. And lastly, on cooperation with relevant instrument frameworks and bodies, um, fragmentation across institutions was one of the key driving forces behind the negotiation of the BBNJ agreement. And the increased engagement from IFBs is definitely a positive sign for future cooperation and coordination with BBNJ. But as cooperation frameworks are developed, we have to keep in mind that it will be essential to ensure that the treaty's own institutions, bodies, and decision-making processes are designed to deliver its objectives at the necessary level of ambition and pace. So the BBNJ is designed to overcome this fragmentation and deliver at speed. So during PrepCom 3, there was an agreement on how are these cooperation principles, but there were concerns also raised to ensure a balanced cooperation that will support the achievement of BBNJ. There was really a good number of representation from IFBs, and including an increased engagement from the regional fisheries management organizations, pushing for a stronger role in the BBNJ implementation. And then so the High Seas Alliance thinks that cooperation should support and strengthen these and not constrain it, so that the agreement can deliver a timely conservation outcome, including the establishment of marine protected areas. So definitely the cooperation cannot dilute the ambition that the BBNJ promises to deliver. So after PrepCom 3, the treaty has already entered into force. We already had the last session of the BBNJ PrepCom, and the ocean crisis is accelerating, and the urgency is definitely high. So the priority now is to move from negotiation to delivery, and the COP1 must make this system fully operational and not reopen any negotiation. So government must use the next coming months to narrow these differences and divergence, and come ready at COP1 to take decisions. What is needed now is political will to implement the treaty at speed and at scale. So I think I will leave it at that, and happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Rita, and thank you to the few people who have already added a couple of questions. We've also got Daniel Cashel-Reese, our cross-cutting coordinator for the High Seas Alliance, and Ghazali Arella, Indigenous Peoples Advisor, on the briefing to add in their expert opinions for you all. So I just realized that perhaps not all participants can see the questions, but we'll just run through them, and please continue to add questions as we go. This briefing is really intended to give you information that's helpful for understanding the BBNJ agreement, where it's at in the process, and to inform your reporting. So please just use this opportunity to ask any questions you have. So the first question is from Sybil Gile on new observers. So with new observers, does it matter if they come from countries who are parties to the treaty or not by the time the Conference of the Parties sits? I might just hand that. I'm just going to act mostly as moderator here. So I will hand that to Riza to answer and as a start.
Yep. Thanks for the question, Stephen Gila and Beth. I think there any indication it was not clearly or explicitly stated in the draft rules of procedure that observers, for example, civil society, should be based on countries that are already state parties to the agreement. But I think it in general, observers that are categorized, because there are different categories of observers indicated in the current rules of procedure, aside from relevant UN bodies and relevant instrument frameworks and bodies. There are, for example, civil society, indigenous peoples, local communities, and currently there is no like criteria whether you need to be part or you need to be based or you need to come from a state party. So I think I will leave it at that.
Great, thanks, Risa. So we have two questions on the Secretariat, and I know that it's an issue of a lot of interest for people. So hopefully you can all now see these questions and feel free to add in. But first from Annika, China's Secretariat bid has received a lot of attention. What could a successful Chinese bid mean for achieving the treaty's objectives? And the second question, which is related, is what do you see as the strengths or weaknesses of the three different national bids to host the Secretariat? And what practical differences will we see in how the treaty operates based on who ends up hosting? So I will perhaps hand to Daniel actually to start with this one, and then anyone else can, Risa or Ghazali can come in.
Thanks a lot, Beck. So in terms of the Secretariat bid, the High Seas Alliance has expressed its neutrality on this question. However, we think there are a number of matters that would be important for the Secretariat to function well, to deliver the ambition of the treaty. And that includes values like neutrality and impartiality, transparency and accountability, inclusivity, collaboration, participation and good outreach, administrative and operational efficiency, and adequate resources to provide for and attract high-level expertise and specialists. Because in the end, the Secretariat is always the first point of contact, both for stakeholders and for parties. And also being able to effectively communicate with international media, having reliable, secure, and effective internet access, and the flexibility and ability to adapt to a changing environment. Maybe one thing to note is that also already with existing UN bodies, there's a host country agreement that grants that organization particular rights, privileges, and immunities, and this would be the case for all of the host countries. And as my colleague Riza said, one of the things that is still open is, will the future Secretariat be linked to the UN, meaning that the normal UN rules and privileges apply and that it would be a similar host country agreement as with existing UN bodies, or will it be an independent Secretariat that needs to negotiate its own host country agreement? And this is potentially what makes the bigger difference in terms of the conditions and the ability for the Secretariat to exercise its functions. And please, colleagues, do feel free to add in other comments and details.
Maybe I can just add on the question on, what are the differences on the three offers. During the last session of the PrepCom, each country who bids for the Secretariat have the opportunity to present for example, the immunities and privileges that they would plan to extend to the BBNJ Secretariat, commitments in terms of infrastructure and other accessibility and outreach, and as my colleague Daniel mentioned, beyond those commitments and offers, we think that it's very important to ensure that inclusivity and access and transparency are the primary criteria that many of the countries are also looking at, not only civil society. And there is a uniqueness from each offer. So we will definitely know by COP1 who will be taking the lead on this aspect.
Thanks, Riza. And there's a supplement question for you, Daniel. Do you think the Secretariat should be UN linked or independent?
Thanks for the question. Well, this was a very tough discussion at PrepCom 3 that I believe the co-chairs would have liked to find agreement on, and states were not able to agree on, partially because some states felt that it would best be decided next to, in parallel to, the decision on the seat of the Secretariat. As High Seas Alliance, one of our primary objectives is for the ambition of the treaty to deliver change on the water as quickly as possible. And the fact that a UN-linked Secretariat would be able to reuse a lot of the rules and regulations that the UN has in terms of, for example, staff regulations, for example, the UN's pension fund, the internal justice system, means potentially a lot less internal development of rules. An independent Secretariat might first have to develop those rules, for example, between COP1 and COP2, and then get them adopted at COP2 before it can fully start hiring staff. Of course, in the meantime, the interim Secretariat by the divisions of Oceans and Law of the Sea would potentially still be providing support, but simply based on the speed by which implementation can start, probably a UN-linked Secretariat would be beneficial.
Great, thanks, Daniel. The next question from Anjali is, what's the scale of the anticipated financing needed to deliver the treaty's aims? So I can answer this one. I'm happy for anyone else to come in. But essentially, there isn't yet an exact figure of what would be required to implement the treaty, but it's estimated at least in the order of the hundreds of millions per year in terms of implementing the treaty fully at a global level. That could rise to the billions per year, depending on the levels of cooperation and contribution voluntarily contributed from various developed states. So, but I think just as a kind of important reference, the value of the high seas and in terms of what it provides to shipping, fishing, underwater cables, all of the industries that really use the high seas, it's an extraordinarily valuable system in the kind of many billions per year. So a few hundred million a year is probably a very good return on investment. And that's something that's really started to be discussed through discussions on the special fund, which is the fund that will be able to receive both public and private contributions to fund the implementation of the treaty, but looking at where are the sources of funds that we can ensure that implementation is done at the scale that is required and to be able to achieve the objectives of the treaty. I don't know, Daniel or Riza or Ghazali, if you wanted to come in with anything extra. Nope. Okay, so we also have a couple more questions. From Emily, hi, do you think a new PrepCom could be organised before COP1 to advance a maximum and refine some drafts of decisions? What, in your views, could reinforce the political will to implement the treaty at speed and scale requested? Who would like to take that question? The answer is definitely no, we don't want another PrepCom. But Daniel, do you want to start, and then Riza, you can jump in.
Thanks, Beck. I think that of course, we are now at a time when the co-chairs report from PrepCom is not out yet, and we cannot speak for the co-chairs, and the process is in their hands. Based on their communications during PrepCom and before, it sounds like they did not want another PrepCom meeting, and that it would likely be intersessional work in some form, including, for example, as Riza mentioned, on the clearinghouse mechanism that would be taking place between now and COP1.
And may I add on the follow-through question on what could be the political will that could, push things forward? I think in the past years, or at least the last couple of years, on how the number of parties really have gone up since the treaty was adopted by the UN General Assembly. It really shows that, despite everything that's happening in different regions, multilateralism still works. And you see among the delegations that there is the spirit of cooperation. It's just that during this intersessional period, it's important for countries to find those differences and how to bridge those different views and divergence to make sure that by COP1 we will only reopen the negotiation on issues that are still in bracket. The rest we move forward because time is crucial. Time is of the essence for the treaty to be implemented. Um, it should be implemented right after, I mean, in theory, upon entry into force. But these procedures and and other guidelines are really essential to make sure we have the right processes and institutions. So I think on the political push, there is always a political push. It's just finding the right compromise to make sure that those divergent views are considered when it comes to decision making in BBNJ.
And yeah, and just to add to what Riza is saying, and so for example, the Indigenous Advisory Mechanism, that is also one of the things that will be taken up intersessionally. And even though there was no opportunity for delegations to engage on the potential advisory mechanism when it comes to traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples as well as local communities, there was an appetite amongst member states actually to pick that up intersessionally and have a decision or have it established by COP1. So on many different areas, would underscore what Riza and Daniel has said. There's an appetite to make sure that the BBNJ is fully operational and that their architecture is fit for purpose, and that includes also the what Riza mentioned in her presentation as well, the Indigenous Advisory Mechanism. So we're very much looking forward to that as well.
Great, thanks, Ghazali. I think maybe one last thing that can help to creating and facilitating the political will is good, reliable reporting from journalists, strong engagement from civil society in continuing to encourage governments that this is a priority, that it is urgent, and that without these institutional structures and process set up, we cannot address the biodiversity and climate crisis which we are facing, and we need urgent action to at least slow down the collapse, the planetary collapse that we're really seeing. So I think those couple of other, and of course, in terms of looking towards even other sectors of society, scientists and other lawyers, their engagement, continued engagement, basically, is really, really critical at this time. This is not the time to take the foot off the gas. It's really the time to really recommit and keep our eye on the prize, which is actually being able to achieve action on the water, more fair, equitable access to those resources and conservation. So maybe since we don't have any other questions, that's a nice place to end, unless anyone has any final questions to add in. I think that could be a good place to conclude. Of course, if you have any follow-up questions, do feel free to send them through. And we'll be happy to answer anything. Of course, we will, as we get closer to COP1, which it will be in January, we will do more, probably another press briefing in advance of COP1 to help journalists and reporters to understand what the key issues will be, where things are at, and how things are progressing. So please do keep in touch. Thank you so much for joining us and have a great day.
Thank you.
Mm.